Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Terry Chiplin. I'm the event director for the US Trail Running Conference and also this webinar series. Welcome to everybody from around the United States and also some international probably participants as well. So welcome to you all. This webinar series is primarily geared towards race directors and event organizers. Welcome to all of you race directors and event organizers out there. And however, if you're interested in safety and a fan of the sport, then you're also welcome to this webinar as well. And feel free to add any comments on the chat section on the side here on Zoom, and we'd love to see your comments coming through. So put your hands up for anybody out there if this is your first US Trail Running Conference webinar, and we'll see if we get any responses out there then. This webinar is all about producing safer races. We're looking forward to hearing from our panelists here. And John, if you could give everybody a wave there. And yeah, thank you. Chris, good morning to you from very early in the morning from New Zealand. Andy Pasternak. Andy, I guess you're in California at the moment. So
Reno, Nevada.
Reno, Nevada. Sorry. Okay. Bless you. All right. So yeah, before we get going, I just want to say on the theme of safety that we're obviously very upset with the news from the school in Texas this week, and so for any race directors or event organizers or folks participating from the state of Texas, then our hearts are with you at this time. And yeah, very sad news. Safety for race directors. So that's what this webinar is going to be all about. But before we get cracking on the content and invite our panelists to share their thoughts and ideas, then we just want to say a big thanks to Marathon Printing, who are the presenting sponsor for the webinar series. And Marathon Printing is a family-owned company that specializes in producing custom printed items for endurance sports. And race bibs are their most popular item, either custom printed or stock bibs. However, they also supply vital accessories for race directors like pins, bags, and pennant flags, as well as postcards, business cards, brochures, bumper stickers, and labels. And they've been working with me on the US Trail Running Conference since 2015, and they're also an event standard partner for our friends at the American Trail Running Association. And Ryan and his team do an excellent job, and we're very happy to be working with them and thank them for their support. And then this particular session is actually sponsored by a new sponsor to the US Trail Running Conference, is Darn Tough Vermont. And they're an American manufacturer of premium all-weather outdoor and lifestyle socks, backed up by the industry's original unconditional guarantee for life. And that's a pretty amazing guarantee. What more can we want for it in terms of a pair of socks? The company offers both specialty and tactical product lines. And Darn Tough Vermont's specialty line of socks includes hike, lifestyle, run, snow, athletic, work, hunt, and junior styles. And I'm actually wearing a pair of Darn Tough socks now. I won't actually show them to you, but you have to take my word for it. And they're super comfortable. Darn Tough's product is distinguished from industry competitors by 100% USA manufacturing, exceptional comfort, durability, and fit, true seamless technology, and an exclusive blend of either ultrafine premium merino wool or Coolmax Thermalite. And founded by Rick Cabot in 2004, a third-generation sock maker, Darn Tough Vermont operates out of Cabot Hosiery Mills. With a forever focus on giving back, Darn Tough has donated over 1 million meals to the Vermont Food Bank. So pretty amazing company, and thank you for your support, Darn Tough Vermont. And with the support from both Marathon Printing and Darn Tough Vermont, then we're able to bring this webinar series so it's free for everybody to register. So so thank you so much to both of you for your support there. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here, and Okay. So hopefully that's coming through all right. I had a technical problem with PowerPoint just before the webinar, so I'm going to bring this up as full screen mode. Okay. So. Producing Safer Races, as I said, session sponsor is Danta Vermont. So a few housekeeping things. If you do have a question as we go through, then please add your information to the question on the Zoom platform, and we'll get around to that as soon as timing actually works. So John Anderson is going to kick off. He's the medical director from the Broken Arrow Sky Race, and thank you so much for being here, John. Chris Randall is the CEO from Blurter in New Zealand. And thank you so much, Chris, for getting up especially early this morning. And Andy Pasternak is the medical director for Western States 100. And then I'll be the moderator. And we'll also have time, all being well, for question and answers at the end as well. So we'll move along. So this is a great picture of John. John, I'm going to hand over to you now. So if you can take over and just give me a shout, I'll bring you on to the first slide. And thank you so much for being here. And I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Terry. Yeah, if you can go ahead and bring up the first, I think the first slide there. I don't know if you can advance to that, but you know, basically when we're thinking about planning for and putting on safe races, I mean, you know, overall, and I think we all know this, is just the planning and the preparation. We've got what I'd like to kind of address are three just kind of concepts, so nothing, you know, super detailed, but kind of three concepts that I've seen, you know, that I've found helpful, you know, personally in planning for some races, and that I've seen create some problems either through you know, other events or case reports, or you know, reading about certain things as well. So Terry, I don't know, I don't see if the slides are pulling up from your end. I'm not seeing them on my end.
Okay, bear with me a second. So it's saying screen sharing is paused. Okay, I'll stop the share and then bring it back up, because it paused for some reason.
And while Terry's pulling that up, okay, perfect, yeah, great. Yeah, so one thing I wanted to point out to people is I put a link in the chat, which everybody should be able to see there. One of the other roles that I serve, and actually Andy does as well, is with the International Trail Running Association, or ITRA's Medical and Safety Committee, and there are some safety, you know, some medical and safety guidelines that have been produced by ITRA. And we're working on revising some of those. They're a few years old at this point, and there's some updates and things that I think probably make them a little more generalizable and helpful in planning races. But I put the link into the chat there for anybody that wants to kind of peruse the document, and it's a good kind of overview of some of the things to think about when you're planning a race. But on to the three key factors in producing safer races. And this first one, I think, you know, one of the things that we see with trail races and ultra races, that it's kind of an interesting combination of sports medicine or endurance medicine, as well as wilderness medicine, meaning that we have all the typical things that you might think of in producing a you know, a city marathon, but then you take those concerns and you put them in more remote or austere settings often, and kind of more limited access to the racers as well as to resources. And so you have to kind of combine some of the concepts of both of those areas to really, you know, formulate an effective safety plan. And this first one is a concept I think that comes in through some of the you know, the wilderness medicine planning, and anybody who's, you know, doing personal type of adventures, and that's you need to make your decisions before you have to make your decisions. And what I mean by that, you know, just as an example, as you get into race day and the race is, you know, progressing and moving on, if a situation arises that potentially could, you know, hinder the safety of the participants or you know, the volunteers or the staff or anything like that, you don't want to have to decide what you're going to do on the fly. You want to make that decision ahead of time. Often you can, write that into different protocols, adverse weather protocols or something like that, so that when the situation arises, you don't need to be trying to make that decision or caught up in the emotions or caught up in just the momentum, of the race itself. If you relate that to something like, to mountaineering or if anybody's done, alpine climbing or things of that nature, you get this, people can get what's called summit fever, right? And if, you get to a certain point and the weather's bad and the lightning's bad, or, it's getting darker in the day or storms coming in, you might be more inclined to continue to push in an unsafe manner. Whereas if you decided ahead of time before you even started your adventure that, if I get to this point and the weather is this, or the forecast is called for this and it's coming in at this point, we're going to turn around, no questions asked, so that I've already made that decision before I'm in the situation, and trying to deal with kind of the emotions of the situation. And again, that applies to races because, and we've seen this in some races where if there's potential for bad weather, and you get into the race and the race is underway, and you get to a certain point and you're like, well, the weather's bad, but the races are here. I think we should just, keep going. Whereas if you made that decision ahead of time, if the temperature is this and the precipitation is this, we're going to hold the racers at this point. Either pause the race, cancel the race, or whatever your decision was, so that you've already made that decision, so that you're not trying to reconcile, again, the emotions of the moment, of the race with the actual circumstances on the ground. So basically, just make those decisions ahead of time. Again, kind of back into the planning with whatever your medical and safety team consists of. And you can, Terry, if you want to advance to the next slide, we'll go on to the second point. Oh yeah. Sorry, my chat pulled up here. This next one I think is something that I've seen happen as well, and I think we have the tendency to lump these two together. And while there can be some crossover in the roles, especially in action, it's important to separate these roles. And so what I mean by this is you should have someone who's in charge of planning the medical for the race. So, how are you going to address medical concerns? How are you going to staff, aid stations, checkpoints with medical folks? And what are you going to allow people to do medically, and not do? And then secondarily, the role of, if something happens, how are we going to get to people, and how are we going to get people out, and how are we going to, facilitate a rescue? If it falls, and again, in the planning, these two should be, in fairly close communication, because there's going to be a lot of input from both that can be valuable, to each specific aspect, and not just in combination. Certainly, should something occur, and again, this needs to be delineated before any potential event or accident might happen, you need to separate the roles. For example, if you've got a runner that is some sort of, say, heat exhaustion or something. Western States is coming up. Andy, I'm sure, is, and it's already hot here in Truckee. But so heat exhaustion, and so you've contacted a runner on the course. Your medical staff or your medical personnel should only be in charge of medical care. And you should have someone else looking at the rescue plan and how you're going to get them out. Now, again, it doesn't mean that these people can't assist in certain roles, but their responsibilities are going to be, they need to be divided and they need to be clearly delineated. If you have the same person trying to do both, then you're going to do neither well. And I think that's, pretty much all that I have to say about that. But again, it's something that you need to separate prior to the events in the planning, and then certainly in the execution of the events, in the, any particular sort of occurrence that might happen out there. So we'll move on to the third one. And again, these all bottom line, and I think we all know this, is these all come down to just your planning and your preparation. And while there's, significantly more detailed things that, that can go in, I think these are just some general concepts that occasionally get missed or occasionally get managed poorly. So some things to think about as you're putting on these races. So again, that first one, is just make those decisions before you have to make the decisions. The second one is being able to separate your medical and your safety resources. And then the third one is just, it's kind of a general preparation in knowing both your course inside and out and knowing your resources associated with the course. So when you're planning your events, and I know a lot of I recognize a few of the names here in the participants and know a few of you that have been doing this for quite a while. When you need to really know every little place on the course, because, if something happens, it can happen at any place on the course. And so you need to be, you need to have, again, that prior knowledge that you can say, oh, this person's at this point on the course. I know exactly where they are, and I know exactly my resources and my availability to get them. Again, kind of looking at the course and going over, very detailed fashion, you can isolate the potential problem areas. But again, also if something arises at any point in the course, you're going to know where that person is, and how you can get them out. So again, this is something that is going to be, delegated to the team. It's not necessarily one person's responsibility, but as a team in planning the event, you should really know this course inside and out in every little detail that you can. And then along with that is just the local resources that you have. And, this is something that is really going to vary from event to event, in terms of, your location, from country to country, in terms of the available resources and kind of the usual resources that are around. And some of those resources that might be available to think of should be your local healthcare facilities. So you should know what hospital capability is close by, and what sort of emergency medical services are available. And additionally, I do advise, and I try to contact the local facilities and EMS agencies to let them know, what's going on and what we're doing, just so that they're not caught by surprise. And also, because they might want to get involved as well. The other, organizations that you may want to contact and let them know that what's going on and see what sort of resources they might have available, or local search and rescue organizations. And again, while we've seen in some races in the past, and that have had to activate the local search and rescue, it's not an uncommon occurrence for isolated runners, or even for larger groups. If they know ahead of time that this event is happening, they can have some sense of preparation, and secondarily, you'll know what they can and what they can't do. So some search and rescue organizations have helicopter and highly trained technical teams that are available to extract people, or assist in that sort of setting. And some don't. Some have basically, some walkie-talkies and some folks who are willing to walk around in the woods and carry people out. So knowing what those resources are, and opening a dialogue with those, with the leadership of those resources to, again, to let them know what you're doing, as well as understand their capabilities, is going to be important. And also just so they understand, the role that you play, the role that they would potentially play in any situation. For example, as Terry mentioned, I do the Broken Arrow Sky Race, and so we're based out of Olympic Valley at Palisades Tahoe, the ski resort there. And so there is a local, our local EMS services, North Tahoe Fire, our Olympic Valley Fire. And I sit down and I meet with them before every race, and, just kind of go over our protocols with them, and, make sure that we understand what the roles that they will play, in the event that something happens are. And again, this is going to be different probably for every race, but it's important to kind of set up those roles and understand those resources ahead of time. So I think that's probably all I have to say about most of that. And happy to answer any questions now, Thierry, or if you want to do questions at the end, I can do it that way as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. I'm going to put you on the spot now. There aren't any questions there, but I have one. I was thinking, what's the biggest challenge that you've had in the time that you've been connected with Broken Arrow, and you know, how did what kind of just briefly what happened and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say that, you know, you know, there's been some individual type of incidents that I could go into as well, but just, you know, system wide, I think probably two of the more challenging things that we ran into, you know, one was obviously COVID, and you know, I know we had a webinar, you know, several months ago discussing that, so I'm not going to get into that too much. And then secondly was just forest fires and air quality. And while it's not a dramatic, you know, trauma falls, and we've had, you know, plenty of our share of that, you know, things to do with those sorts of things, it's one of those decisions that you need to make ahead of time, meaning that, you know, unfortunately, forest fires are, you know, here in the American West are, you know, a reality in planning races, and a you know, certainly a concern for safety and for runner health. And you know, leading up to usually our event takes place in June, so it's not just in a couple of weeks actually. So it's not a huge concern. One year we had to move to October because of COVID, and that's, you know, unfortunately it's still in the heart of fire season. It just keeps getting longer. And we were dealing with pretty significant fires, really almost until, you know, 10 days or so before the race. And so we had some pretty serious conversations about, you know, what is our number for, you know, the air quality index coupled with, you know, the wind and the weather patterns in terms of, you know, adjusting the event or potentially even canceling it. And that's, you know, that's a tough one, because again, I think as a race production crew, I think it's easier for participants to kind of visualize, oh wow, yeah, it's lightning and snow and it's just, you know, really crummy out there. That seems unsafe to have an event, versus, oh, it seems kind of hazy and smoky, why won't they let us run? And so you're really, you know, you have to again think it out ahead of time, and you know, have some justification for your decision and your communications. I think that was, you know, luckily we were able to kind of go on with it, but it was, you know, creeping up to the, you know, really until the week of the event, that we were kind of you know, figuring out, you know, what our numbers were, and are we actually going to go. You know, I think from an individual perspective, you know, our event is unique in some ways. You know, we're lucky in some ways that we're not, you know, like Western states, in that it's not a multi-day, you know, people are out there for 30 hours sort of thing. All of our races, you know, are, you know, the longest that one of them will take will be 12 hours for participants. But one of the things that we do have is, you know, fairly steep and sustained kind of technical type of terrain with potential for larger falls. And we had one incident just it was the last year, where there was a runner who was down essentially on the worst part of the course for a rescue. And so we had to get kind of a technical rope crew that we had available to get these people lower down and kind of get them out and stuff like that. And I will say this year we have a new race, which is actually more of a climbing race I don't know if folks are familiar with the concept of a Via Ferrata from Europe, but there's a Via Ferrata at Palisades Tahoe. And so now this year we'll have people actually racing in a more of a rock climbing and running sort of combination that is giving me a little bit of heartburn in the planning as we've moved forward, but I think we've got a good plan.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. So Brad Bishop, good morning, Brad, out there. He says, John, can you share more specifics numbers, question mark, of where you landed regarding AQI. We faced the same decision a couple of years ago, and I still think back on that and question it to this day. Or do you have standards published somewhere online as a result of that process? So, so that's a really, really great question, and it's something that we're, we're literally having to live with year after year at the moment in terms of fires and air quality. So, so great question. Yeah, John, I don't know if you've got anything to comment specifically on that.
Yeah, I'm going to make a comment, and then I'm actually going to punt it to Andy because I know he's been looking at this fairly extensely. Basically, it's a bit of a combination. So the AQI is one part of it. You also have to kind of look at the predicted, AQI and kind of the patterns of AQI based on weather patterns. So, your AQI might be 100 every morning, which would be appropriate, from my perspective to have a race, but, by every afternoon, it may creep up to 200, 250, which would not be appropriate. So you're gonna have to look at both the number as well as kind of the pattern throughout the day that you're gonna take your event, as well as the weather. The number that, that we were comfortable with was around 150 and under. If I'm thinking off the top of my head, it may have been 100, but I want to say 150. I'd have to go back and look at my notes. But I'm going to punt the rest of that to Andy and let him take that, because I know he's looked at that and is looking at that fairly extensively.
Cool, thank you, John. Andy, yeah, do you? Yeah, brilliant. Can you chime in on that? I'm sure you have. I'm sure you have something to add on that.
Yeah, let me. Yeah, I feel like who is it? Horseshack and Mr. Connor. Like I'm sort of jumping on. Yeah. So when I saw that question, so we actually published, and I'll try to link it in the discussion here. A few years ago, I worked with Marty Hoffman and a couple of other authors on support for ultramarathons, and we kind of took a stab at air quality, and I'll put a big asterisk on this, because there's pretty good research about exercise in air pollution. So, especially when the Olympics were in China, there was a lot of attention on that, and looking at, what's the effect of having a marathon in Beijing when the AQI is off. There's not a lot looking at poor air quality due to wildfire smoke, and I'm learning about this. I'm talking to all these pulmonary folks and air quality folks, and there are some differences in the AQI from wildfire smoke versus, say, just normal air pollution. But we, in our criteria, we basically said, AQI of 100 to 150, you might want to start canceling. Once you start getting above 150, it's getting really questionable, and above 200 is when you're really going to want to think about canceling. And so there's truly a gray zone there between 150 and 200, where I think there's so many variables. I think we did a race, the Sierra Crest 50K, a couple years ago, and the AQI when we started was about 90, and I worked with Chris Smallcombe, who's a meteorologist, and Chris and I were both running it, so we're like, yeah, this, it's not too bad, and the forecast is supposed to get better. And I think the AQI, I forget what it got up to that day. It was a bad idea. So there is, I think, when John was sort of talking about, planning these things out ahead of time, I think AQI is a really good example of, races really do need to start thinking, especially in races in the West or where there's wildfires, you need to think about, hey, we're going to have some set criteria. I think the other problem with AQI is, a lot of our races are set over, 100 miles. And so, I think the other hard and fast rule is, well, if the AQI is at 150, but it's only for maybe a 5 or 6, the way some of the smoke patterns are, it could be that there's just an isolated part of the course that's has an AQI that's that bad, and the rest of the course is pretty clear. Those are some of the factors that I think are tough to take into account. So we do need a lot more research on it. We're working on a research project. We did a survey, a couple of our races here in around Tahoe last year. We had one of them, the air quality went really bad during the race, and we had a couple other where it was marginal. And so we did a survey of some of our runners to see, did they think the AQI affected them? And so we're working on putting that data together and getting that published. But I think it's like I said, like John said, getting back, it's somewhere in that 150 range, and I think races are going to kind of really have to look to see, how long of a race it is and how much of that is in that bad air quality. And like I said, I'll try to share that link here somewhere.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. Yeah, I mean, Brad, that's a great question. Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, look forward to the link from Andy. Good, excellent. Thank you, Brad. I mean, this is a great question. We're despite the part of what we're looking to do with the sport is to reduce our emissions and help to make bring the climate and emissions and everything back to more normal levels. But of course, in the meantime, we are going to have probably more wildfires continue. It will be probably a few years before we can do much about that. So great questions. Okay, Andy, do you want to? I'll mute you for the moment. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Aaron. So Aaron, you've raised your hand. But do you want to pop something in the chat, Aaron, and or in the Q&A? I think you're maybe trying to get attention, but I can't. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it is you want to say. Okay, Chris, should we move on to you now? Okay. Nope. Sorry. All right. No worries, Aaron. Good to know you out there, though. So, Chris. Yeah, welcome. Yeah, thank you so much. I hadn't kind of twigged that it was so early in the morning for you, so I appreciate you you getting up and getting up at the crack of dawn, probably before the crack of dawn for you right now, and joining us, Chris. So. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay.
I've got plant fans in the house. Awesome. Well, thanks for inviting me on. And to be fair, Terry, you did say if I wanted to, I could pre-record this, but I never find that's quite as interactive, and you can't really ask questions if it's pre-recorded. So I'll do a quick introduction to myself, because I'm probably, for most of the people online, they probably don't know who the hell I am. And blurred is a bit of a misnomer in terms of why Terry's invited me on today. But over the last few years, I've been involved in the delivery of the Tarawa Ultra Marathon in New Zealand, which is probably the race that I've been involved with that anyone outside of New Zealand will be aware of, part of the Ultra Trail World Tour. And that race is in Rotorua in New Zealand. Our tagline for that race has always been the big friendly. So that's the kind of concept around it. So easy to do miler, 100k, 50k, and 21k. There's about 3,000 people that do that race. And then the other notable race that I've been involved with in the trail scene is an event called the Mukilteo, which is on the South Island of New Zealand in Queenstown, and an off-road marathon, 15k and 8k race. Quite different races, quite different environments. There's about 1,500 runners in the Mukilteo. There's also a mountain bike race and an off-road triathlon that happens, and the 50k ultra there has about 11,000 vert in feet. I had to do the calculation beforehand on that one because I only know it in meters, but talk to your audience and all that sort of stuff. So a little bit like John, I've got 3 concepts to talk through, and I'll pick out the bits that aren't overlapping, and I'm not quite sure what Andy's going to talk about, so I'll try and focus on slightly different stuff. So my first point, Terry, if you could step onto the first one, is around internal preparedness. So a little bit like John was saying, you actually do a lot of your work up front. And the way that I generally talk about this is using a risk approach to all of your design and decision making before you even go onto site. And when I talk about a risk approach to your event design, it's most people do this without even knowing it. So if you're going to do an event, the time of year that you do it is really important. The way that you design your course, the course could go many different ways. actually how you put that together and the way that you assess the risk in terms of the decisions you're making, even from the word go, is really important. John talked a little bit about system design. For me, with system design, there's a couple of additional factors that I think are worth thinking about. And for me, it's who do you need to wrap around the systems that you create to make sure they're successful on the ground? And that is in terms of the resources you need and those other things. So you might have a great system set up, but could you actually resource that system, and who are the right people? And I always joke at this point, you get on the ground and suddenly everyone turns into an expert on the weather, particularly around trail races. And there's lots of different systems you can use to track weather, and suddenly everyone's got an opinion on what's going to happen if the wind's doing this and the cloud cover's doing this and where the storms are coming from. But actually knowing who are your experts that you're wrapping around those systems to help you with your decision making, and actually make sure they're legitimate experts and not just people that say they're good at what they do. So in terms of that system design as well, when something goes wrong, who is going to be involved in dealing with that versus who are you going to leave still running the rest of the race for lots of other people? So particularly if that's a medical or safety incident, your system design says, oh yeah, we're going to react in this particular way. What's going to happen with the other 1,000 people or hundreds of people that are doing your race? You still need to race direct that. So if your race director goes and spends all their time dealing with incident A, you somewhat need the resilience with the rest of your team. So in terms of that design piece, for me, it's not just how you're doing it, but who's going to be involved, who are the experts, and how are you going to apply those experts in different situations. So that is risk assessment. And I think when it comes to risk assessment, making sure that you're spending the time to really focus in on what you're going to do in those situations, because I think we've all been there probably a few years ago now, saying there's a risk that there's a global medical event and we're going to respond in a certain way. Now, of course, we've been going through that for a long time now, but I don't think the sort of likelihood of it happening ever really put us in the position to really assess those implications. And on Tarawa Ultramarathon in 2021, we just pre-event, there was a series of earthquakes that happened in the area, and there was a big landslide associated with those earthquakes. We had a risk assessment that said, there might be an earthquake and this is what we'll do about it. But I can tell you right now, what we ended up doing was so much more than what we put in our risk assessment, because we said, it's going to be a really low likelihood that happens. So we didn't spend as much time on it as we potentially should have done. And it happened 2 weeks in advance. So we had a little bit of time, but not heaps of time. And then the last bit on that is test that system design and your risk assessments with the right people in the right room, and do those desktop exercises and really stress test how people are going to respond in those situations and make sure they're aware of what your expectations are of them. So that's my internal preparedness bit. The next slide is what I've called external preparedness. And ultimately, with events, there's a small number of people that do most of the work, and then your workforce gets really, really big very, very quickly. And how are you going to communicate your expectations, and how are you going to communicate what people need to know pre-event or before they start? And think about those in different contexts. So when it comes to athletes, how are you going to communicate what is needed of them? And we've traditionally done this with things like race briefings and information on the website. What I've become really conscious of is the amount of information and the amount of knowledge and preparedness you want to give to someone who's doing their first 100-mile race versus someone who's doing a 10 or 15K race that, very experienced, are quite different sets of information for different audiences at different times. So if you're going to leave it until a race briefing 2 days out to brief your 100-milers, then you may have missed 11 months of opportunity to start that communication process. And I worked with a doctor in New Zealand, Dr. Tom Reynolds. He's very, very passionate about making sure that he's engaging people through their entire training and preparedness. So the athlete comms can be a long conversation. And the other one there is just a throwaway comment a little bit, but how are you going to communicate expectations to supporters and support crews, particularly around those very long events? What is possible for them? Where can they get to? How do they get there? And particularly around fatigue of supporters driving to different locations and things like that. So how are you going to communicate with your supporters and making sure that they've got the right information? And then workforce, suppliers and contractors, one mass of different people. These are the people that you need to communicate a lot with in terms of what are your expectations of them? How do they communicate back to you if they have an issue? And particularly in volunteer groups, they tend to come on very, very late and have, in lots of cases, a lot of responsibility. How are you connecting with them? And again, think about over what period of time you have available to you. I know it's not trail running, but the example I'm going to give is from a mountain bike stage race. 7-day-long mountain bike stage race. We started our staff engagement in our health and safety protocols 3 months out because it was quite a substantial amount of information we needed to get to people. So we actually had a training program for our own staff and contractors and volunteers that lasted a long period of time, because we knew that we needed to give people more information than they were going to be able to digest in a 1-hour session. And the other thing there is, if you give people the protocols that you need them to follow, make sure that they're actually digestible for somebody who hasn't spent years and years developing them, because they may not be as specialist as you guys are, and specifically not as knowledgeable. And it's really easy to say, oh, in situation X, do Y. And that's on page 67 of our health and safety manual, or buried in Appendix B. But no one's going to remember to get their manual out of their bag to refer to that when they need it, because there will be, John picked up on it, when things do go wrong, the emotional turmoil that people are going through, the energy that's just expended on people looking after themselves is really high. So for that external preparedness, it's setting expectations. What can we do? What is expected of you? Breaking it down into digestible pieces of information, and then thinking about the medium that you're going to use to communicate that. So when everyone turns up, they know what's expected of them and they're ready to execute. And then my third piece is really about that execution. So
Chris,
just on the next slide, Terry.
Chris, can I pause you before you jump onto the next slide, or before I jump onto the next slide for you? Brad has a question here on the chat. On Chris's point about making sure people can do what they say they can, which is a great point, I think. Is there a database to check someone's licensing or credentials, especially medical? Or are you recommending we make it common practice to ask medical staff to provide a particular document to us as race directors for verification? Now that might be a country-specific thing, I guess. Chris,
there might be and Andy might have a view on this for the US. So I think the general point that I'd say is make sure that you're getting the right processes to verify when you're engaging people, not after the fact. I'd typically outsource to professional companies or professional organizations for most of my specialist services. So whether that, excuse me, whether that's medical or safety, or even other things like, electrical, or when you break it down, you think, oh, I'm not going to try and put up a massive marquee on my own because I don't know how to do it. I'm going to get a company to do it themselves. So I typically work with professional bodies to get that. It's a little bit more difficult if you're using individuals to fulfill certain roles. And then for me, and talking about New Zealand law, it's really important that you are making sure that you're getting their licenses and risk assessments and everything, so you're satisfied with it. But Andy might have a view from the medical side for the US.
Yeah, and Andy or John, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I can kind of jump. I mean, I do think one of the issues that comes up with the medical coverage of ultras is, I'm incredibly fortunate that the races, between Western States and Tahoe Rim Race, we have a group of physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, PAs, foot care specialists, physical therapists, who are all eager to work. They all have some background. A lot of them are ultra runners or have family members that are ultra runners, and they understand the sport. And so it makes my life a lot easier. It is interesting, when I go to other races, I often, introduce myself to the medical teams. And depending on the race, depending on where the race is, a lot of times it is that the race directors are hiring EMS, local EMS staff or things like that to cover the races, which is great. It's good that they have medical coverage. But a lot of times those folks may not have the background in ultra running, even though they might have all the right degrees and things like that. So I think, just checking someone's credentials, it's a good place to start. In the United States, it's pretty easy, for anybody who's licensed. You can go to a state licensing board and look up the person and get that information. But I think beyond licensing, I mean, we have some really incredible, there's a woman I work with who's a nurse practitioner, and she's one of our best I trust her medical coverage as much as I would trust any physician. Sometimes we get into these hierarchies of like, oh, physicians are, but when it comes to things like ultras, you really want to make sure that it's not just what degree they have, but what experience they have in that area.
Cool. I think, Chris, sorry, just jumping in there again. So that's certainly going to be true for medical personnel, but then you also mentioned about weather too. So it's like, how do you check somebody's credentials in terms of being responsible and have credentials on weather, that kind of thing. So
so I think in that space, I mean, there's not really a weather forecaster's qualification, so to speak, in the same weather, but I think then it's looking at the environment that you're working in and what's experience people have. So in the Southern Alps, when we've done races in the Southern Alps in New Zealand, I tend to work with safety teams and that are used to working in those alpine environments, whether that's the ski season or other things, and then designating that the person within that team that's going to give you your weather advice is X, a particular person because of whatever reason that might be, rather than me who's gone on a particular website and interpreted data. So I think there it's making sure that you're clear who you're really going to listen to when it comes to it. And to John's point earlier as well, there's a difference between medical and safety, or medical and recovery. And just because you've got a really fantastic doctor who may be really good at dealing with endurance-based sport trauma, you don't necessarily want them being the person that's recovering somebody off course, because there's two sets of skills. So being really specific, I think, is important. And then the third one is making sure that you're actually then putting all of your theory into practice. So being very thoughtful around making sure that what you say you're going to do, you can actually do on the ground, which is easier said than done in a lot of cases, particularly if you haven't done step 1 and 2 particularly well. But the best way of doing this is over communicating and encouraging people to tell you what's happening. So what are your communication networks that you're creating? What's your chain of command? Can you create a centralized event control, or is your race director running around doing lots of other things? And I work with races now in a sort of consultancy capacity where I'm trying to get race directors to do less so they can actually direct the race that they're accountable for, because they want to be doing all of these different things. They want to be over here helping in athlete check-in or registration. They want to be starting the race. It's like, could you just stop and please sit in one place so you can assess all of the information that's coming into you and help your teams with the decision-making process? So that's really important. And so I don't run over into Andy too much, how are you going to make sure that you're doing what you said you were? So actually thinking about how you're going to audit it. And audit's a little bit of a health and safety word potentially, but it's, for me, it's a little bit more than just the formal audit, but actually how are you going to check that you did what you said you would? And then how are you going to review the effectiveness of it, and making sure that you're putting enough time in post-event to really sit down and do the analysis of what went right, what went wrong, and using those case studies. And you can only really do that if you've gathered great information through the process. You've got really good records of the communication that was taking place. So in that execution and response piece, make sure anything that you've designed is practically achievable. Otherwise, you may have got your design slightly out. And I'm going to pause there because I want to make sure that we've got enough time for everyone. Sorry, I'll have a chat.
Okay, brilliant, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdoms there. And so, Andy, we'll pass over to you now. So we've got a bit of time left, but
yep.
Yeah. So,
well, I'm glad those two went first because they basically said everything I wanted. I mean, that was, both of them were just, both John and Chris just brilliantly, I think, laid everything out there. So, you know, I would just really echo everything that they had to say. I mean, you know, anything I would have prepared would have basically overlapped with everything they have to say. I would say probably just a couple of comments on both the things they would say is, I think for people who are doing medical care at ultras, it's really important also to try to get involved with groups like ITRA. We do have, and again, my email's out there. We do have a Google Groups email that has a bunch of people that are, you know, both race directors and medical directors, and it has various levels of, you know, during the winter it's kind of dormant. During the summer, it starts to pick up a little bit more. But I think one of the hard things that I've noticed with ultra running and have thought about with ultra running is, for a lot of your medical volunteers, this might be a once a year event, or at most they're going to cover maybe 2 or 3 events a year. This isn't, you know, John Anderson is an ER doc, you know, he's seeing patients, you know, frequently, and you get into a pattern of how you do things in the hospital. But I think and all of our medical folks, they you know, in their normal day jobs, they know what they're doing. There's a pattern. They know how to do stuff. And, you know, and we have these incredible volunteers that come and work at these races. But I think getting both the John and Chris's points, it's really important for them to get your medical volunteers to think of what are the specific things that they're going to have to worry about for that, you know, that race day or that race weekend, that are different than what they're dealing with. And, you know, we run medical folks through things like, you know, BLS and ACLS, and we do these sort of practicing exercises to get people ready. So, you know, and I'm always amazed. I remember, you know, doing ACLS and BLS and thinking, am I going to remember this when stressful times happen? And it is pretty amazing that if you rehearse it enough, when stressful times happen, it becomes it's literally a reflex. So, you know, I think as much as possible, trying to get your medical teams involved in thinking about some of those things before race day is absolutely critical. And like I said, I think all of, you know, getting involved with groups like ITRA, or if, like I said, if people want, I have them email me and I can get them involved with I think we call it the Ultra Docs Gmail group. And that's a good way that we all need to learn from each other, because again, most of us are doing this. You know, a lot of us are volunteering for these things. A lot of us are doing this maybe, 1 or 2 weekends out of the year. So it is good to kind of learn from people who are doing it on other weekends and get their experience.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you, Andy. I want to kind of jump in a question for you again, Andy. So I asked John that, what was the biggest challenge he had on Broken Arrow? Andy, what's the biggest challenge that you've had at Western States and maybe Tahoe as well? And what was it and how did you deal with it?
I think our, so last year at Western States, I think our biggest challenge was, it was frankly the heat last year. And, we had a lot of runners, especially, it was a tough year for heat. It was a tough year. I also think last year was challenging because a lot of our runners, again, at Western States, and John and Chris kind of talked about this a little bit, one of the advantages we have at Western States is the runners are relatively experienced. I mean, they have to qualify, meaning, they've done a 100-miler, they've done at least 100K to get into the race. So we do have a little bit more experience, but I think, we also, it's such a hard race to get into that the runners at Western States push themselves, they want to get that buckle because they know how hard it is to get into the race. And one of the things that we're trying to do this year is to do more runner education ahead of time. We've done some podcasts with some speakers talking about things like heat illness and hyponatremia. So we're trying to, what I'm kind of hoping is that by educating our runners ahead of time, maybe we can prevent some of those problems on race day. So so that's really our sort of after last year, that's been kind of our challenge for this year.
Cool. Thank you so much, Andy. I didn't see the details, but I saw recently there was, I think it was a road, might have been a road marathon, but it was, I think held, I don't think it was super high temperatures, but it was pretty high humidity and had some issues in terms of, I think there was one fatality, but also some others who, other people who got pretty ill. So yeah, I think what you just touched on, Andy, is a really good point in terms of runner communication. That we're, of course, one thing that we're doing as a sport is we're often attracting people to a different environment from the environment they're used to. So if they're used to training, say here in Colorado, for example, with really low humidity, then going to an area that's more humid, then runner communication, I think, is really important, and that's something that we could all probably learn from. John, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on that particular point. I know your race isn't high humidity, but I'm sure I don't know if you have a kind of a medical perspective on that particular challenge.
Not necessarily with the heat, but I think it's just worth reiterating Andy's this kind of concept of runner preparation. And I think, Western States is doing a really good job with that because, I mean, ultimately, you want to have your participants be able to take care of themselves and provide them kind of that, that independence to both help themselves and, potentially help others out on the course, because you've got, 300, 500 runners and, 20 medical staff or whatever it might be. So I think, the preparation of the runners, to kind of go back to Chris's point as well, that external preparation, is an important concept to look for. It's kind of loud. I did done some medical for some of these stage races, these desert stage races, and people's feet just get, torn up. And while it's not, a huge life-threatening type of thing, it's certainly a race-ending type of thing. And you have some runners who will come to you every day to they want you to fix their feet, and we've kind of developed this concept of, listen, I'm going to show you how to do your own feet really, really well today, and then every day from now on you'll be able to do this for yourself. If you have problems, obviously come back and ask. And I think that's, again, if you can prep the runners to be able to help themselves and prepare themselves, that's you're step in the right direction, whether it's heat or anything else.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think the runner communication piece, I mean, with the platforms that we now have available, I mean, a podcast might be a little trickier for people that haven't got, you know, that particular technology, but doing something like a Zoom meeting, or maybe even a Zoom webinar is really accessible and pretty cost effective. So so using those as an example for to get runner communication out there, and I think that's probably a really important point. Okay, we're, oh gosh, it's 12 o'clock already. Yeah, we got, the time flies, doesn't it? Okay, so thank you so much. I'll really appreciate your participation, everybody out there, and sure, yeah, Chris, perhaps our paths will cross at USTRC. Thank you, Sherb. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Big thanks to John and Andy and Chris for being our expert panelists out there, and I did check all their credentials before I asked them to come on. So I'm just highlighting that. Yeah, please contact me at this email address if you have any comments or questions. And our next webinar is June the 30th, again 11 a.m. Mountain Time, on marketing and communication. And so thank you, everybody out there. Remember that we're in the business of making a difference in people's lives, and please be safe, and yeah, respect yourself and other people, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a trail out there soon. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording soon.